This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, first and foremost, we want to wish our Muslim brothers and sisters all over the world, the 1.3 plus billion Muslims, Ramadan Kareem and Ramadan Mubarak. We've just in the midst of the holiest lunar month of the year for Muslims worldwide, where Muslims are fasting from sunup to sundown and recommitting themselves to prayer, reflection. And this year, there's a lot to reflect on.
Yeah, and what better guest to have during this month than Dr. Hatem Bazian. We've talked to him. Let's listen to the interview. Muslims all over the world observe the month of Ramadan to mark that God gave the first chapters of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. During the month of Ramadan, Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset. The fast is intended to bring the faithful closer to God and to remind them of the suffering of those less fortunate. Ramadan is a time to detach from worldly pleasures and focus on one's inner self. It's also a time for families to gather and celebrate. As with last year, Ramadan will be different this year again. There are restrictions on what people can do as the world is still dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. Joining us to discuss this and more, Dr. Hatem Bazian, co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College and founder of the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California, Berkeley. Ramadan Mubarak, and welcome again to Arab Talk, Dr. Bazian.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Jamal. Ramadan Mubarak to you and to your family, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to see you and to be with you.
Let me begin by asking you a question to dispel one of the myths about Ramadan, that it's all about the food. If one refrains from eating and drinking, but let's say continues to be mean-spirited or continues to lie and cheat, do these activities void the fast?
You're maybe asking me the question, would it be possible that Trump can keep a fast of Ramadan? I would say it would be an impossibility. I think the idea is of Ramadan is to have God consciousness, both in body as well as in action, because there is a relationship between the outer form of the human being as well as their inner form. Ramadan is about abstaining from eating, drinking, and all of what we call nourishing the body, but likewise is also abstaining from injuring people, from using foul language, even listening to foul language. So what we say is the fasting of the limbs, meaning your hands, your feet, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, all those are included. So if somebody happened to insult you during the month of Ramadan, you just say, peace, I am fasting, and you just actually depart from them. And in this way, it's really a way to change your habitual self. So if you would think about Ramadan as an idea of how to remove bad habits. And again, one of the more critical bad habits we have is about overconsumption of food, not thinking about what we are consuming. I think here in Berkeley, we have the sticker, you are what you eat. And I think Ramadan could be understood that to be more deliberate and thinking about what you are consuming, with the idea to reduce your consumption of food, and then also to be deliberate in your consciousness and your relationship with those with you, whether it's family and those in the community, in such a way to manifest what we call the good society. So that's how we think about both the outer and the inner dimension relative to fasting Ramadan.
Last year, the month of Ramadan felt very different for obvious reasons. Again, this year, Ramadan is upon us, and many people are under lockdown. Many mosques are empty from worshippers. Religious sermons are done over Zoom. Do you think that Muslim communities have adapted to spending Ramadan away from family and friends and not going to mosques?
Well, I think, let's say in the Bay Area, there's been what you call an opening of some of the mosques for limited participation. So there is some at 25%, and I think in some places it'll be about 50% accommodation. But I think the larger question that we need to ask ourselves, if you have the balance of religious observance versus preservation of life, in this sense, Islamic legal discourse or legal precept says that preserving life is ahead of observing the particulars of Islamic law. So in here, there is a requirement for you to go to the mosque, to engage in religious observances in the mosque. But we have a pandemic, which in essence is a life and death situation. And therefore, what we say to people is that to make sure that you observe all the medical regulations in relations to worship, the God that wants you to go to the mosque is the God that also wants you to preserve your life in relations to the pandemic. Is there a difficulty in people religious observance with the pandemic? Absolutely, like everything else. There's difficulty for us to teach online. There's difficulty for you to do interviews on Zoom and so on. It's difficulty for not to go and see your elders and visit them, considering that maybe some have already been vaccinated. So definitely these are critical moments, and they don't happen so often. Thank God, every 100 years that we're having the pandemic from the Spanish flu to now. So it is definitely a diminishment of some aspect of the communal part of Ramadan, but the balance has to be struck in there. Preserving life goes ahead of observing the particular aspects of Ramadan. Lastly, I think in parts in here, we're in Northern California, there's an increasing sum of ease, so people still can do certain things. So maybe people can maybe gather for an iftar in the park where you could keep social distancing over 6 feet and still have a way for you to enjoy a communal gathering. But also it's a month of giving. Maybe instead of having these large gatherings, we could find ways to express a higher level of spirituality by sending the food to those who are maybe needing it more at this point than us.
Well, I mean, you've mentioned something very important, which is, of course, Ramadan is also a month for giving. And many people have lost their jobs and their livelihoods. It's been hard on everyone since COVID raged across the globe. What can Muslims do to help each other and other communities during these difficult times?
Yeah, well, this is very important. I think even though that the data shows that the economy supposedly is recovering, but I think it's also give us a distorted picture. Maybe there is a recovery on the higher level into Wall Street and so on, but this should not be confused with a large number of people who, especially in the hospitality arena, in the small businesses, in the restaurant, in the hotel, all these were, or even in some of the taxi drivers in terms of the financial districts in San Francisco and others. These are individuals that really depend on people being around and being able to benefit from the full economy and full activity of the society. And in particular, we see that women have been impacted considerably because they actually have a large number of jobs that are in general in the hospitality, in the restaurants, and so on. And from Muslims that I know, both the immigrants and the indigenous part of the Muslim community, they're still impacted Even before COVID, as some of the data that for the study in the San Francisco Bay Area, San Francisco had close to 38% of the Muslims were under the poverty line.
Wow.
So we don't think about the Muslim community in the Tenderloin, on the Western Addition, or in the Upper Mission. All these are really pockets of Muslims that are facing economic disparity and difficulty. We also speak about Oakland, Hayward, the far outlying area of Marin County. So we have considerable need or what we call food insecurity as a result of the pandemic. So Ramadan is a month of giving. The Prophet was known to be the most generous, and he was the most generous during the month of Ramadan, was described as being more generous or more giving than the clouds that are bearing heavy rain in terms of a blessing. So I know that there are many efforts locally, speaking from the Northern California Islamic Council. There is food collections. There is the nonprofit humanitarian is making the food delivery in different locations, also giving about 25 pounds of boxes for food for families that are in need at this particular time. So there are many of these issues. I know that I work with Zakat Foundation, where they have partnered with DoorDash to actually make a number of food giveaway and feeding during the month of Ramadan in San Francisco, in South Bay, in Hayward, Fremont area. So these are definitely ways to contribute to addressing the food insecurity. It's a small amount because, again, we are talking about a massive need. So I encourage at least Muslims who are able to find ways to address the needs that are there. Now, in Islamic tradition, it says, Al-aqrabuna awla bil ma'ruf, that those who are close or next of kin or relatives are deserving of your goodness. So I would encourage Muslims to look at their extended family, to look at those who are part of their relations, and to see if they are in need. This is the time for you to actually extend a gift for them to make sure that their food and nutritious needs and food insecurity are addressed during this time. So this is how at least your expression of Ramadan, of generosity, to be extended to the community, not only the Muslim, but also your neighbors. The Prophet said that none of you truly believe if they go to sleep fully with full stomach and satiated, while their neighbor, and again, 7 ways in each direction, goes to sleep hungry. He didn't say whether the neighbor is a Muslim or of other faith. He says it's really none of you have faith if your neighbor is going to sleep hungry while you're satiated, because it's a lack of consciousness of the need of those who are next door to you.
Absolutely. I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about Islamophobia.
Sure.
This past Sunday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that Islamophobia has turned into one of the instruments used by Western politicians to cover up their failures. Do you agree with him?
Well, I agree. Again, if you look at what has taken place in France, France is trying to cover its failed domestic policy. It is deteriorating social welfare program for the society. If you remember, there were the Yellow Jackets protests, which was all a large segment of their public employees, large segment of the French working class that were protesting the changes in medical and healthcare coverage, the changes that were being sought in relations to retirement and the pensions, changes that are in relations to education. So that you had a whole massive, what you call neoliberal economics package that were being pushed by Macron, as well as some of his opposition on the right way. So again, the left, center, and right basically have adopted neoliberal economics. So in the mix of this massive reorientation of the French state, and a massive protest, Macron comes out, begins to target the Muslim community anew, with saying that Islam has a crisis. So all of a sudden, he became the mufti par excellence. Maybe there's an opening in Al-Azhar for what you call a new mufti, maybe Macron, and he could bring Marine Le Pen with him down there. So he stands up and says Islam has a crisis, that we are dealing with separatism, that the Muslim communities are separate, and begin to have a whole package of targeting Muslims. And I actually say that Europe, France being paradigmatic of it, has an Islamophobia and an inquisition problem. That Europe is really reintroducing a whole set of policies that are reminiscent of the Inquisition, where you dictate to Muslims that they cannot wear their religious dress. You dictate to Muslims that they cannot eat their halal food. So there's actually a legislation to prohibit halal chicken and the slaughter of halal chicken in there. Whether you're vegetarian or not, we could set that an issue, because again, it's not that the French state all of a sudden is going vegetarian, but it's actually dictating a halal restrictions on halal. It's also trying to regulate Muslim mosques, closing mosques. And if you look at the regulations during the Inquisition period, we are having a same type of dynamics. So this is what is taking place in France. It's used as a way, as a distraction, and as a way to actually escape addressing the issues that are there in France. So instead of dealing with the neoliberal agenda, in there you ration up that we're dealing with the Muslim threat. You also increase, because a part of the legislation is actually to prohibit monitoring, recording what the police is doing. So if you think about police violence in here with the camera recording what the police, in France is also legislation to, in essence, to protect the police from actually being taken into account, because in France, the police is often being deployed heavily in the suburbs, where many of the, not only Muslims, but other immigrants from the French colonies are there. The last part of this is the French is saying that the Muslims are expressing their identity, and therefore they're trying to be separatist from the French society. Now, the interesting part is that France began to bring the not only Muslim population, but population from its colonies, Muslims and otherwise, to work in France in the late 1800s, and deliberately put them outside Paris, away so they would not be seen. So again, here in the US, the suburbs are where white flight from the inner city took place after the 60s. In France, the suburbs where you actually throw out the undesirables, in essence, or those that you come into Paris to clean the streets, you come into Paris to work in the restaurants, you come into Paris to work all the menial blue-collar jobs. And then at the evening, in essence, if you say a highly, I don't want to say civilized, but a highly manicured separatist policy, apartheid policy, where you separate those that are of lesser subhumanness and you deploy them in there. So now as the suburbs began to be large and increasing in terms of population as a result of continued immigration, as a result of intervention in the Francophone zone, now the French stands up, well, you are separating from us, right? And blaming what they have constructed, right, in this. But lastly is this notion in France, and I'm going on because I think the discussions about what Erdogan is saying, the discussion in France is that you cannot be French. You have to be French to the source. If you take this, which is something that is being wrapped around cultural racism, is that you don't have the blood of French, which means that there is a biological demarcation between being French bloodline and not being French. So these Muslims that have been there for 150 years can't really be French. They never can attain be French. So this structured Islamophobia that pushed by the state is in essence saying that Muslims don't belong in here. and in essence is used as a way for the state to say we are in an emergency status so we can deal with the social issues of the larger society. And unfortunately, some of those that are being stoked to accept this get the distraction and accept to use Islamophobia to vote against their own self-interest. And similarly, in the Brexit in the UK, a similar type of dynamics that Islamophobia was used as a way to really shift the blame from the state into the Muslim population. That is the crisis in Austria, targeting Muslim population, in the Netherlands, Belgium. So this is what we're dealing with in relations to using Islamophobia as a distraction from the economic, political, social issues that are prevalent right now across Europe.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, France is a prime example. I mean, the only emergency they have there is really now COVID, and that shows the failure of President Macron and this distraction. In fact, on March 30th, the French Senate voted to stop women under the age of 18 from publicly wearing the hijab, and also in that essence also prohibiting, as you know, kids go to school on picnics, wherever, prohibiting their mothers from accompanying them. You know, so every week there seems to be a new law or a new happening. I think 2 weeks ago they tried to prevent a mosque from being built in Strasbourg. I mean, it's just like going out of control. We've been accustomed to seeing politicians railing against Muslims, be it in France or the United States, but also ordinary people are being accosted and harassed. Thankfully, these incidents have been captured on camera, the most recent of which a woman going after an Egyptian-American Muslim woman and her husband in a grocery store in Florida, saying that they are not humans because they are Muslims. What can Muslims do to combat Islamophobia in the United States?
Well, there are a number of things that can be done and need to be done. One is we do need to document these cases and be far more robust in doing the work of collecting all these incidents. Data has to be collected and to bring context to what has taken place. It's not isolated incidents, just one here and one there. It's actually a host of Islamophobic incidents take place. I know a number of cases, again, from our Islamophobia reporting app, where individuals are harassed relative to their name. So again, you're an employee, your name is not Osama, your name is something else. Your manager, as you come in, say, here comes Osama. Because again, your Muslim is associating you in a direct way that you are representative of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, or joking around, where's your bomb? All these are incidents that are taking place at the job site in a real way. So there's a variety of things in relations to data. Children who are being harassed in school, bullying relative to their Islamic identity. So data collection is very important for the Muslims in order to actually bring a full breadth to what is occurring. Second, there is no way for you to actually deal with this without actually empowering the community and to be assertive. I'm very critical of thinking that we could solve Islamophobia if we just tell people how good Islam is. Again, it's not a what you call trying to say that it's good or bad Islam and so on. And therefore, if we just get people to understand Islam, therefore they're going to stop. People have understood the Christianity, but they're still racist toward Black people, right? Or they also had a long history of understanding Judaism, but nevertheless, they still express anti-Semitism. And for those who at least are around these days in the Bay Area, we have relations and understood the Chinese history, the Japanese history. People celebrate the Chinese New Year in San Francisco and different places, yet the intense anti-Asian sentiment is there. So we have to get away from this notion that if we just beautify ourselves, that the other will accept us. So I'm against this notion that the problem is that they don't understand who you are, and what you need is to go and put Fair and Lovely, right, as a cream in order
Prove yourself over and over again.
Beautify yourself in this sense to be acceptable. And I separate between the need to convey to people and have a basic understanding. As an educator, I do need to educate people in general about Islam, as well as the history of the Arab world, Muslim world. That's a separate category from dealing with Islamophobia as a racial epistemic that target Muslims because they're Muslims on a racist attitude, and therefore empowering the community to push back and to be vocal about it. So the respectability politics that often has been used as a way to really do a double silencing. On the one hand, you are not addressing Islamophobia and racism toward Muslims. And the second is that you are actually excusing the racist because you are allowing that respectability politics to engage in dealing with a racist construct that is actually being pushed. I always compare that the red light in a traffic light is to actually get you to stop. It is not. So what you need is actually a robust policy that we push for in order to create a countermeasures to deal with racism as racism, rather than to muddy it up and to say that engaging in respectability and beautifying one's face as a road or a path to respectability, which gets us into this, model minority that's been used in relations to Asian Americans. That did not stop racism. It's actually continued to intensify because you use the success cases as a way to silence the majority others, right? Mm-hmm. So again, we need to be very careful on how we approach Islamophobia and how to challenge it, both within the Muslim community and the broader society.
In one of your publications, The Islamophobia Industry and the Demonization of Palestine Implications for American Studies, you make a strong argument by saying that the field of American studies must more aggressively tackle the spread of Islamophobia because it has become an overtly acceptable racist discourse that is saturating civil society in the United States and Western societies in general. Now we also talk about the othering of Islam and Muslims has become an acceptable norm. Are you saying, when you talk about this, are you talking about also educational institutions? In mind that this is where the study about Islamophobia should begin, not only in universities, but also probably in middle schools and high schools?
Well, for sure, I think the educational institutions have been culprit and responsible for how Islam is framed and how the relationship with the Arab and Muslim world. I think you cannot engage with the study of Islamophobia without recognizing how the academic institutions have, for a long period of time, continued to embrace Orientalism. If you think about the work of Edward Said, if you think about his work covering Islam, which was one of the early pioneers in looking at how the media covered Islam, this is again in 1981, at a time that, so for those who think Islamophobia or anti-Muslim sentiments in Western discourse is only a byproduct of 9/11, Edward Said's writing on covering Islam in 81 then had a revised edition in 97 in this sense. So an academia has always operated with what you call the canon that centers Eurocentricity and otherwise much of the world, including a heavy focus on the Arab and Muslim world through Orientalism, through Islamophobia, and so on. Even the term itself, Islamophobia, appears early on in French, around 1910, to speak about the French inimical relations or inimical treatment of Islam during their colonial legacy in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Right? So academia bears a responsibility. Post 9/11, as you possibly are aware, many of the academic institutions embrace the security studies. So now, rather than looking at Islam and Muslims as co-participants in producing and transforming society in general, many of the academic institutions responded to power. Again, knowledge and knowledge production is intimately connected to power. So as the war on terror was unleashed, which terrorized Muslims across the globe with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and the destruction, many of those academia jumped into the opportunity and began to do all the types of security study, theorizing about how terrorism is, and began to get contracts from the government. You had the whole field of CVE, countering violent extremism, which I call it the whole field of junk science, but got funded. And unfortunately, some Muslim organizations also and Arab organizations jumped and applied to get CVE to actually monitor themselves. So academia and schooling has been really, I use the term embedded intellectuals or embedded scholars, that they're embedded with empire, they're embedded in the production of knowledge that rationalizes the whole war on terrorism and how it's applied to the Arab and Muslim subject. And I think what we need is a complete re-examination of what is, how the Muslims is being presented in academic settings. Is the discussions often involve about either the first sentence or second sentence or the first article, Islam and terrorism, right? So immediately, or Islam and violence, or Islam and women. So always a problematizing, as Muslims are an exception to the use of violence. So if you think about the 20th century, right? And again, this is not unique to me critiquing, but if you look at how Islam and Muslims are presented, you would think that the only violent group in the world is Muslims, even though that Muslims in the 20th century and into the 21st century have been the primary victims of violence. And the Western world in general gave us courtesy World War I, World War II, with, again, World War II, if you want to think, Hitler belongs to the Western world. The Holocaust is a production of the Western world itself, and it's a epistemological construct relative to anti-Semitism. But they had the audacity to stand up and continue to otherize Muslim and Islam, to rationalize the continuation of a military-industrial complex, continuation of a class of civilization, continuation of intervention, continued all these policies that I would say at the core are destructive, both to the world and destructive to our own society. It's not surprising that the military budget continues to increase unabated, and using the fear of Islam and Muslims, introducing academia and percolating throughout, upward and downward, to rationalize the structure that we are living in at the present period.
Lastly, Muslims in America are diverse. No racial or ethnic group makes up a majority of Muslim American adults, and 20% are Black, according to a 2017 survey by Pew Research Center. Since George Floyd's murder, Muslim Americans have mostly shown solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Was the murder of George Floyd a catalyst for a stronger bond and solidarity with their brethren and sisters in the African American community?
Well, I am hopeful that work needs to be done to address intra-Muslim racial attitudes and perspective. Muslims are not immune to internalizing the racist and racial epistemology within America. In the American society, and I would say the global society today, we still have an operable racial matrix. The racial matrix that still sees and negates the life, the human possibilities and potential of Black subjects. So as Muslim immigrants, as well as other immigrants, arrive to the United States, they always situate themselves on top or above the Black subjects, and they're always aspiring to whiteness. So they're aspiring to arrive at the white city upon the hill, and they don't want to identify with the darker, more complex complexion right there in the valley. And that produces, again, the conflicts in the inner city tends to produce some of these dynamics. If you, at least both in San Francisco, Oakland, so on, the point of contact for the Muslim community of the immigrant type in general with the Black community is often happens at the corner store, where many Muslims, unfortunately, own the liquor stores. And it becomes a point of flash between the Arab community often and the Black community, which is exactly what happened with George Floyd in Minnesota. The owner of the grocery store in there is a Palestinian, right? So you can't actually escape this inner dynamics relative to race, racism, the relations in the inner city, the situating of the tensions in there, which is a byproduct of the racial matrix and racial structure stratification in the American society. And therefore, you actually are producing the same epistemological structure in the society with capitalism, and capitalism does function in commodifying the human being and situating where people are at. So it's not enough to say, well, we have solidarity with the Black community as a result of the George Floyd incident, which is needed, but to think structurally, what does the solidarity looks like, and how to unlearn racism, right? Because it's you respond instinctively to solidarity when you see such incidents, but the heavy work, can we transform ourselves as Muslims, as well as the broader society, to unlearn racism and to begin to shape a different type of society? I do believe that Islam is an anti-racist religion. Muslims are still acting in racist ways because they have adopted a Eurocentric worldview that situate them within the racial structure. They aspire to be white, right? And they don't like, and they want to distance themselves from the Black community and the communities that they see are not empowered. The last aspect, you could see this very clearly in Muslims who are aspiring or at least engage in interfaith dialogue. Most of Muslims who engage in interfaith dialogue are only attempting to engage in interfaith dialogue with white churches, as well as engage with possibly some of the Jewish community in relations to assumptions of access and importance, meaning that they have not even thought that some of the strongest possible alliances that can be struck on interfaith would be with the Black community and the centrality of the Black church in relations to the civil rights movement. So while they are apt at quoting Malcolm X or quoting MLK, they actually don't have any structural relations. They don't engage in interfaith dialogue. I am a person that I don't like the whole field of interfaith dialogue. I like interfaith work for justice. So I would actually try to engage with those individuals that have a long history of interfaith work for justice, those who were in the forefront of the anti-apartheid movement from the Black churches, Black community, Latino community, those who were in the forefront of the struggle for Latin America during the Reagan era, trying to stop the U.S. intervention, low-intensity warfare in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and other places. We did not have to go around and sit in a manicured conference room to think, what do you think of God? And let me tell you my think of God, what's your text? And we were actually manifesting the text by trying to actually elevate the work for justice as we walk collectively. So I'm very critical of the whole Muslim engagement of interfaith dialogue. That's actually, it's an interfaith work for power rather than actually interfaith work for justice. So I'm very critical that those relations are not there, and a preoccupation with whiteness at the top of the hill rather than engaging for transformative work in relations to racism and race construct in the society.
Dr. Hatem Bazian, thank you again for coming on Arab Talk, and again, happy Ramadan to you and to your family.
Thank you, Jamal. To you too.
Well, that's Professor Hatem Bazian. Hatem is a professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. He's one of the co-founder of the Islamophobia project, and has been on our show multiple times Jamal, and in my opinion, really no better person to talk about not just Ramadan, but the state of the world when it comes to, what's happening to Muslims all over the world.
Absolutely, especially, talking about Ramadan and how Muslims can help each other and help other communities during these dire times under lockdown and during the pandemic. But also, the number of Islamophobic incidents are on the rise.
Yes.
Not only right here in the United States, but specifically in Europe, like France, just like Dr. Bazian spoke about.
That's right, Jamal. And of course, as we've been talking about on this show, we are in, solidarity with all communities that are being attacked and oppressed and disenfranchised right now. The Asian American and API communities, are especially hard hit right now. African American communities, well, we're going to be talking about yet another African American who's been murdered in the midst of, the constant assault on, African American men in this country. But it does seem like the attacks on Muslim Americans and Muslims across the world has taken a bit of a backseat in terms of its discussion in the media. But it's, as Hatem said, it's not like it's slowed down that much, especially in Europe.
You're absolutely right. You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco. This is 89.5 FM. We're going to shift gears and we're going to go back to some of our topics. Jess, AIPAC has
They never stop, Jamal. They never stop.
Campaign.
Yeah.
I know, but this is their newest campaign targeting Representative Betty McCollum of Minnesota, Democrat from Minnesota, as she has been leading congressional critique of Israel's military detention of Palestinian children,
right?
Introducing multiple pieces of legislation that would bar Israel from using U.S. military aid to arrest Palestinian youth. She recently said in an interview to The Intercept, and I'm quoting here, "I don't want $1 of U.S. aid to Israel paying for military detention and abuse of Palestinian children, the demolition of Palestinian homes, or the annexation of Palestinian land." And now all hell breaks loose,
of course,
with the culprits. I mean, here is one congresswoman who AIPAC is unable to put in their little pocket.
Well, Betty McCollum has a long history of, a commitment to justice for all people, but she has been especially strong, especially when it comes to the brutal, illegal, detention and torture techniques that the Israeli military uses against children and women and men of all Palestinians, but especially, children and women, which are especially brutal. And, in 2020, last year, Jamal, AIPAC did issue a number of statements against Congresswoman McCollum, calling her, the typical names. They said she was an anti-Semite, engaging in anti-Semitic activity just for criticizing Israel. And she basically has said that AIPAC is a hate group because of their attacks on people who try to criticize Israeli policies.
Listen, 53% of Democratic voters, this is a poll conducted in the Gallup poll.
That's right.
This year, support increasing pressure on Israel and holding it accountable to human rights violations. Yet, unfortunately, most Democrats, and of course, the majority of Republicans, if not all, in both in the House and Senate, oppose conditioning aid to Israel.
Of course,
U.S. aid has in small writing a condition that it cannot be used for violating human rights or abuse. There's a whole kinds of clauses
right.
that the United States has the right to not give you.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. except for Israel. I mean, it's just going on day in, day out, where you see Palestinians being abused. They're using, during the war on Gaza, they've used U.S. aid, the military bombing civilian homes, schools, hospitals, and
Well,
of course, the arresting of children and the demolition of homes. And they don't want anyone to say a word about this.
well, Jamal, I think, it takes one person like Congresswoman McCollum to stand up and to speak that kind of truth to power. You have to give Congresswoman McCollum so much credit, even more credit than a lot of the progressive voices within the Democratic Party who have continued to be somewhat silent on Israeli atrocities. We also know, for example, that Israel was probably behind the attack on Iran this last week, too, in terms of what they did to the Iranian nuclear reactor in Natanz, Iran. We know that they are continuing to bomb in Syria and continue to wreak havoc in the Golan Heights and do other kind of dirty deals. And yet no one seems to kind of raise their voices. We can't expect the House Speaker Pelosi or the Senate Leader Schumer to do anything about it. It really comes to really amazing and really strong voices like Representative McCollum to take a stand on this. She deserves a lot of credit under these circumstances.
We'll keep an eye on this story just because.
But Jamal, they haven't been able to get her out of office, which is kind of interesting. I know they've tried.
Yeah, well, they also tried to get rid of Ilhan Omar, and also from Minnesota. So it looks like that's a good base for progressive Democrats.
Finally.
Finally, and they'll lose in that sense if they're trying to push her around wherever. I think it's not like before. It's not like what happened to other congressmen, years back. I remember one of the very first books I've read when I was studying political science. They Dare to Speak. You remember?
Right, Paul Finley.
What happened to him?
Right,
and he spoke about his experience when he just said no to AIPAC.
Right.
And they marched on to destroy him.
Right.
And have done it to others. So
right.
Hopefully there are some now strong backing to these, I would say, human rights activists in Congress.
Exactly. We will keep all of our viewers and listeners posted on this. And as a segue, Jamal, unfortunately, the murder of African-American men by law enforcement personnel continues on I want to say daily, but at least weekly basis now. I believe, in terms of incarceration and, arrests and, false imprisonment and all that, it's probably daily. But yet another African-American young man, 20-year-old Daunte Wright, was murdered by a policewoman in this case, in just outside of Minneapolis. Yet again, Jamal, we're seeing African-American men being murdered by the police departments for a traffic stop.
Yeah, I watched the press conference today by the attorney of the family. It was heart-wrenching.
It's terrible.
Jess, and I remember something, and I'm paraphrasing here, that was said by the attorney, which he said, because just to update our viewers, the police woman, former Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter, was arrested and charged yesterday on Wednesday and charged with second-degree manslaughter.
Yeah, not murder.
And she's expected to make first court appearance today, just either via video, sometime in the afternoon. And so there was a press conference by the Wright's family lawyer, and he said the reason that there was a quick arrest, this comes with the blood that was paid by all, and he named all the African-American men who were killed by police
recently.
You
That's
know,
a lot.
of course, starting with George Floyd and going down the line. And I was thinking about it. Yeah, that's true, because if you remember, when these things were happening, you remember the father and son who chased another African American young guy down in a neighborhood and chased him. Basically, daylight lynching and killed him. And the father was a former police officer. They weren't arrested. They were let go. The police came and let them go because they believed their story that was in self-defense.
That's right.
Until another person who was behind took a video, and the video surfaced. And that was, what was it, months later?
Oh, many months later, Jamal. It was a really extended period of time and outrage and protests it took just to get these people charged in some way for murdering another black man. And, second-degree manslaughter, Jamal, is very painful and insulting for the Wright family to have to, bear, because we all saw the video. She took out her weapon and shot him at point-blank range, and he was dead within minutes. And the idea somehow that she mistook the taser for the weapon doesn't really hold a lot of water, Jamal, because in the last 20 years, there's only been a handful of instances like that. And just so that our listeners and viewers understand, the difference between a handgun and a taser is so dramatic, is so obvious to anybody. The taser is in your non-dominant hand. The gun is always in your dominant hand. The gun weighs a lot more than a taser. A taser is a different color. So the idea that a 26-year veteran of the police department would get confused between the obvious difference between a taser and a gun, it doesn't hold water. But there's a bigger question, Jamal. Why are you pulling a taser on a young man for a traffic stop? What's the problem with letting, okay, he gets out of control, he leaves, he's not coming after you, he's just, getting in his car, go get him and attempt to talk to him or arrest him in a normal way. But that's not what happens with African Americans.
Look, Jess, there are laws on the book in California and other states that you cannot even chase someone, like jump in a police car and go after them if they were fleeing, because you're endangering others.
Exactly.
And you're endangering passersby and so forth. They say, okay, let that person go. You can always, go and arrest them at their place of work or at home.
Absolutely.
I mean, they've had his license plate. She didn't have to. I don't understand. She's 26 years in the force. I've never carried a 9mm Glock. That was the weapon. Looking at the picture of the Glock and also I've actually never handled a taser. Same thing. How can you mistake a taser or a Glock for a taser and vice versa?
You can't,
I mean,
Jamal.
if you
You
serve
really
in
can't.
the force for 26 years, the yellow handle, I looked at the picture, it's yellow, one is black,
And
one is heavier than the other.
Much lighter, Jamal, much lighter. And it's in your non-dominant hand. So if you're pulling out anything with your dominant hand, 99 times out of 100, it's a gun.
My question is, and people don't like to ask this question, sadly, replace Daunte Wright with a young man who's white, who is his age, same incident, would she had reached for her gun or taser that quickly and shot?
No, of course. You would never.
That's the picture. This is the question. It's not the mistake. To me, it's like it's too often that we see, black men getting shot so quickly, just like by police without hesitating.
Well, Jamal, and this is happening in the middle as the defense in the George Floyd murder trial of Derek Chauvin rested its case today. So it's going to go to the jury. Final closing arguments will be made within the next day or two, and then it's going to go to the jury. And this trial, Jamal, is only 10 miles away from where Daunte Wright was murdered by, former police officer Kim Potter. So this whole area in the Minneapolis area is going to be in the hot seat nationally and internationally to see what this jury does with Derek Chauvin and his trial for murder against George Floyd. To be honest, Jamal, I've been watching it very carefully. The testimony has been compelling and overwhelming that Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd and killed him. But I'm afraid that the jury is going to let him go. I think it's going to happen yet again in this country where a police officer is going to be let go for the murder of another black man.
Well, I'm hoping that you'll be wrong on this.
I hope so.
It's really sad to keep watching these time and time again. No lessons learned. I don't know what can be done. This is something that has to be basically reinventing the police department across the United States, re-educating all police officers so we can avoid future incidents from happening. Just quickly, have 1 minute, and we'll talk about it actually next week. Facebook keeps censoring Palestinian content and pages.
Including you.
They've shut down the Ahmed page, and recently they limited my page and threatened to shut it down for 30 days for a post in which I juxtaposed the murder of Daunte Wright to when the police allowed Kyle Rittenhouse, remember him, the young white man who killed 2 people and walked past the police, I guess, checkpoint,
freely,
carrying an AR-15, and they let him go. So I put those pictures and said, this is what happened when you're white, and this is what happened when you are black. And then I got that reaction from Facebook. We'll talk about it next week. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Follow us on Twitter. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episodes, and we will talk to you next week.
See you next week.